All right.
And we're live.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. We're doing the last panel of the last day of RTC Online 2020. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for everybody who's joined all of these panels that we've had over the past couple of months. It's been great. It's been a nice way to distract ourselves from what's going on and getting some interactivity with readers. So today we're going to be talking about LGBTQIA plus representation in romance. I will probably often use the term queer instead because it's much easier to say. And we have a bunch of great authors of queer romance with us today, which is fantastic. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is great. So we're going to start off with introductions, and then we will get into some questions that we have. So I'm going to tag Nathan first.
Hello, my name is Nathan Burgoine. I jokingly refer to myself as the tall queer guy who writes mostly short queer things. Usually I write novellas and short fiction. I have been drawn into writing a couple of novels, most recently a YA novel, a queer YA novel, Exit Plans for Teenage Freaks. But for today, I'm going to try to keep my romance hat on, which my most recent one was Faux Ho Ho, which is a fake relationship Christmas queer romance. And I will just let us move on to the next person.
Great, thank you, Nathan. Adriana.
Hi, I just panicked for a minute because I thought I had hung up. Hi, I'm Adriana Herrera. I write a romance full of people who look and sound like my people, and many of those people are queer people. So, my debut romance series is the Dreamers series, and it's a series about 4 best friends who grew up in the Bronx, and the first 3 books are gay romances. So I write Afro-Latinx centered romance.
Great, thank you. Let's go on to Keira.
Hi, I'm Keira Andrews, and I write queer romance, historical, contemporary, paranormal, just all sorts of subgenres, and I just love happy endings. And
Hi, I'm GB Gordon. I write a little bit hope punk. I like it dark with a happy ending. I write a lot of speculative fiction and suspense. My first book was Santuario, followed by The Other Side of Winter, and my latest one is Match Grade, and there may be a sequel to that. We'll see what the guys are saying. And I think that's it about me.
Thank you. Leigh.
Hi, I'm Leigh Bailey. I write contemporary young adult and new adult gay romance, and then I write some quirky paranormal shapeshifter gay romance, and yeah, so angsty young adult, new adult, and then quirky, funny shapeshifters and unusual pairings. That's kind of me.
Oh, thank you. Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I wrote the Chaos Station series with Jenn. So science fiction is one of my favorite genres and I love to write it. But I also really, really like writing stories about ordinary people doing very ordinary things and who just happen to be queer as well. That's kind of my favorite thing to write when I'm not writing planets that are trying to kill everybody and aliens. That's me.
That is definitely Kelly in a nutshell. Sheri Lynn.
Hi, I'm Sheri Lynn. I write mostly paranormal, some erotic, mystery, romance, kind of just like all over the place, but it's always got a happy ending. That's the most important part to me.
Yes, love the happy endings. Has to have it. Kristine, last but not least. Kristine,
Sorry about that. Just trying to figure out the interface here. So I write mostly erotic romance and contemporary romance. A fair amount of MM as well as MMF menage, and also MF. My specialty is firefighters.
Great, thank you. And I'm Jenn Burke. I'm your moderator. I write queer, male, paranormal mystery, science fiction with Kelly, and yeah. So I'm really happy to be here with everybody today to be talking about this. I think it's great. We have a fantastic group, like I said earlier. So I'm going to start off with pretty much a question that relates to why we're having this panel discussion. Why is queer rep in books important to you? And let's go to, we'll start off with Sheri Lynn.
I think it's very important to have representation of things that match what we are and our lifestyles. I think without that, it's kind of hard to have some kind of something to look forward to, look up to. I know when I was a kid, I didn't see many stories that matched who I was. So I think it's important that there be a bunch out there of all kinds.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Let's go to Kristine.
I think that everybody wants to be able to relate to what they read, and whether you're a queer person or you know queer people are in everyone's lives, and so our books should represent that. I also think it's a way of sensitizing people to other groups that they may not be a part of, and to the lives of these people, so that they become more familiar with them. And they say when you're more familiar with something, you're not wary of it anymore. So it's a sensitization factor as well.
Okay, thank you. Nathan.
For me, I think the biggest piece has been when I grew up, there were no queer people in my family. We don't have a hereditary or an inheritance to queerness. So those stories are pretty much the avenues we have for sort of the generational pass off that happens in a lot of marginalized communities, because we don't have that. Like, it's not like queer people are born to queer parents and have queer grandparents telling them all sort of what came before, or what it was like, or what to expect, or even just the language to use to describe ourselves. So as much as I'm always going to be grateful for my non-queer readers, the representation for me is definitely for queer readers, so that they can maybe see themselves, maybe find some language they didn't know they needed, or even just, frankly, to see a happy ever after.
Thanks. Adriana.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, thinking from my perspective, I started writing queer romance because I wanted to see romance that was intersectional, that I could find queer romance, but I couldn't find a lot of Afro-Latinx queer people in romance. And so for me, I think, when I think about what I want to see the future of queer romance to look like, I want to see more nuanced, more diverse representation of what a queer person is. And that can be neurodiverse, that could be gender identity, that can be all the things that are like the queer community. I'm thinking about this weekend, and for queer people of color, like for Black queer people this weekend, thinking about the identities that make us, like our Blackness, and the emotional pain that's happening around that is important. And that's something that I think needs to be in romance. So that's, to me, what's important about queer representation for people of color.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very important. Let's go to GB. Why is queer rep in books important to you?
We all need to be seen, because if we're not seen and not reflected, we don't know who we are. That's one thing. And the other thing is a little bit how that representation happens for me, in that most of the times queer romance is a subgenre, and I don't see it as that. And that's a hill I'm prepared to die on. If anybody is a sub to anybody, that should be a choice. That's not my kink, but please don't make anybody a sub by putting them on a special shelf, and that doesn't just go for queer romance, that goes for a lot of other subgenres too. I subscribe to science fiction or suspense or gothic being subgenres of romance, but not the people or the kinds of love that are in it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Let's go to Keira.
Well, when I was growing up, especially as a teenager and a young adult, I was hungry for queer content. I didn't really understand why at the time. And I think part of that is because I had never, as a teenager, I would never have thought, oh, it's because I'm bisexual. I just didn't have the vocabulary for that. I mean, I'd heard the word, but it just didn't register as something. It was just an obscure idea. And I think also once I did find movies and books, they were always so depressing. They were usually about gay men, and they usually died in the end. And it was just so depressing and disheartening. And I really feel that queer people deserve happy endings and need happy endings, that it's really vital that queer people have happy endings, and that's the norm and not the exception.
Excellent. Yeah. Kelly.
For me, it's a lot the same that everyone has said about being seen, and having queer characters do be able to be the hero, to be the pilot of the starship or the pirate, or just every role that's in a book, not just in the sidekick or put in a story. Color, and that's what I love putting in my books, is that I write the books I do because queer people are bakers, they're butchers, they're architects, they're bagel shop owners. They're out there doing very ordinary things, and those are the stories that I want to tell, because it's I think someone else, I can't remember who, that sensitization issue of just being part of the landscape of humanity. That's why it's important to me.
Awesome. And last but not least, Leigh.
So most people have covered, I think, all of the really important pieces. For me, it's kind of the combination of, I think that our books, especially in romance, should represent our world. And right now, even just by sheer numbers, they don't yet. And I like to see that diversity there, especially with the happy ending. I like being able to have characters who are living their life and can find love. And I like knowing that when I'm reading something, no matter what's happening to them, it's going to end in that happy ending. And I think it's particularly important that we have that for queer characters, because and I think it was I don't remember, sorry if it was Keira or Kelly. So much of what I had read when I was younger did have that sort of tragic ending. And I like being able to see and develop and show that the endings don't have to be tragic, that we can be, to Kelly's point, ordinary people living our lives, and that becomes a component that has this sort of happy ending. There's a positive, there's hope to it. So I tie it really closely to the same reason why I think romance is important. It's about that sort of hope and positivity and a positive reflection of our world.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to another question, unless anybody has anything to add. You can raise your hand if you do. Okay, so let's talk about what you would like to see more of in books regarding queer rep, or what you would like to see less of. And let's start with Kelly.
More science fiction. I mean, if we're just talking genres, there's been a wonderful explosion of science fiction from some of the bigger publishers that have queer representation that isn't just side characters, it's the main character as well, or, you know, they are the band of heroes. And I just don't think there can be enough of that in really popular fiction. I mean, in popular contemporary fiction too, like women's fiction. You know, that I read a fair bit of that because it's about people like me, you know, something-year-old who owns a shop and has a daughter and is going about my life. I'd like to see more representation in stories like that as well.
Is there anything that you would like to see less of with regarding to queer rep?
Not really, because I think that writers, I know I tell the stories I want to read, and there are writers out there who need to write these stories. They have stories to tell, and they need to write them, and there are readers for them. And yeah, I'm not going to tell anyone else what to write there.
Okay, great. Let's go to Leigh.
Some things that I'd like to see more of, especially in the romance world, like we're really, like in terms of queer rep, we got male covered a lot. And I love it, so I don't want to see less of it. Like, I think it's great, but I would like to see more of like a more diverse spread of the different kinds of queer and the different kinds of labels and the different people within the community. So we are very heavily focused on gay, whether it's because of sales or promotion or whatever reasons. I want to see more FF. I want to see more asexual representation. I want to see more transgender representation. I want more of that. So I'd like to see that stuff come out. And I know the last couple of years we have been seeing more, but it's not enough. And I'd like to see it get taken more seriously by some people in publishing. I'd like to see it more popular on the reading list. Like there's all, like people are looking for it, but I don't think there's enough of it yet. So I just want more of all of it.
Don't we all? Is there anything that you would want to see less of?
Not really. To Kelly's point, I mean, people write the stories that they want to read, and I think there are readers for it. So no, not really. I think everything has a place, whether it's to my taste or not.
Okay, thanks. DB.
I think I would like to see more ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. I like your firemen and my Leos as much as anybody else, and I still would like to read more 40-somethings battling family problems or office things, or, you know, just everyday people who are battling interesting, extraordinary circumstances. That can be anything, really. That can be abductions or something really wild out there. But yeah, that would be really interesting, I think. What would I like to see less of? Under-researched stuff. And maybe in the same vein, queerness as plot. I think I would like to rather see novels that happen to people who happen to be queer rather than their queerness being the topic of the book. That I could definitely use less of, the queerness as a plot.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, let's move on to Nathan.
For more of, I think you're going to answer more of and less of at the same time. So often I find when I'm reading queer romance, especially, that there are two queer people in it, the two queer people who are having the romance. So I get, not frustrated is too strong a word, but I would like to see more representation of the way that queerness is generally also a component of found family, and that we aren't just sort of bopping around in our little queer bubble. There's more to it than that for the vast majority of us. I obviously there are some of us who are completely isolated, and that's something to explore as well. But yeah, like I find I can't remember the last time I read a mainstream MM, if I could even say such a thing exists, where there were lesbians or trans women or an intersex character, or where the intersections of identity went beyond white. So like I really appreciate what Adriana was saying earlier about how we need more voices that don't just exist. Like we don't have one without us. Like, it would be very nice to see more queer characters who are not just the queer character. And I think that's my biggest ask, or my biggest wish, is like, where are my Black deaf lesbians? Because I know two, but where are they in the books?
Great. Let's go to Adriana, since that was a really nice dovetail with what she was talking about earlier with representation of people that look like her.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely kind of going on what Nathan said. I write queer communities of color. I don't write to people in a vacuum who are queer brown people. What I'm trying to do with my books is bring the reader into the Afro-Latinx immigrant experience. And that, to me, has to do with us, with reflecting what we look like in our worlds. And queer brown people have queer brown friends. And so like those are the pieces of really digging into more nuanced representation. I think for me, that's my challenge and kind of my mandate for myself, to do more and more with building out what the queer experience looks like for all like the different kinds of shades and colors of like Afro-Latinx people. That's what I would like to see more. And yes, more trans romance, more people who are on the spectrum in terms of like their gender identity, more neurodiverse queer people, exploring class difference, exploring diasporas, like those things, because I think that, like as GB was saying, queerness as a plot, I feel like in 2020, we could really explore more to those identities and just the fact that the person is like being gay in the world. And in terms of less, I'd like to see stronger female characters in queer romance. I'd like to see, strong like women, even if they're supporting characters, women who are like whole people and not just there to like serve a function for the development of the emotional arc, because so many of us are women, so much of queer romance is written by women, and I'd like to see us like our bodies represented in different ways. And I mean, for those who are female or women presenting, right?
Thank you. Sheri Lynn, what would you like to see more of with queer rep or less of?
I think it goes back to something that actually Nathan said a few years back at when I was on our RTC panel with him, and it's something that's stuck with me since then, was about when they say they've been tested, that it's not clean because they're not dirty. I can see Nathan nodding. Yeah, you remember that? It's something that's stuck with me, and every time I read a book now, I notice that. And it's something that's really bothered me ever since then. So I'd love to see less of that. But so as to more, I would love to see more mainstream. Just see us in bookstores. See, people not being ashamed to read it and to say that they write it. That's a big thing for me. You still get so many looks for saying that, and it just kind of bothers me still. Even comes from my family, and it like, oh, your sister writes this, you should write that too. I don't want to. It's not what calls to me. But you get looked down upon for it.
Right. I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with for sure. And let's go to Kristine.
All right, so for me, it's I think very similar to what Leigh said about acceptance of the different types of queerness, and by acceptance, I mean a lot of times it's from the readership, even like the community itself. For example, menage books. This idea that bi people sometimes would like to be in a menage. A lot of people think that that's fetishizing. But there are bisexual people, men and women, who do like to be with more than one partner. And for other things I'd like to see more of, as somebody else mentioned, is more of the trans characters and that kind of thing. Yeah, I think just more representation in general and more acceptance from the community itself.
Is there anything that you would like to see less of?
Less of, not really. I mean, I think there's a place for everybody, and everything everybody wants to write.
Okay, great. And last but not least, Keira.
I think for less, I'll just echo what others have said about having better representation of women, and so less stereotypes, maybe I'm not sure if that's the right word, but and for more, I think more trans for sure, more FF, more diversity all around, and definitely more own voices. I think that's something I would love to see more of.
Okay, great. All right, let's move on to the next question that I have. And it kind of dovetails with what we were talking about not having the queerness of the book be the plot of the book. A few years ago, I went to I believe it was at Limestone Genre Expo, which is an expo that's held in Kingston, Ontario every year. And we had a good discussion on an LGBTQ panel there about just LGBTQ representation in books in general, not necessarily just for romance, but I can't remember. I think it was Derek Newman Style. I think that's his name. I should have looked it up. But he is a scholar here in Ottawa who does a lot of studies about queer representation in fiction. And one of the points that he had is that the idea of moving beyond the coming out story, which I think ties in really well with what we were talking about how having the queerness not be the plot of the book. So I wanted your thoughts on that. Do you think that we should be moving beyond the coming out story in queer romance? Do you think it's still needed? What are your thoughts? And we'll start with Keira, since you're on my screen.
Okay. I would say that we definitely still need coming out stories. And I think, on one hand, if readers and writers don't want to explore those stories, then by all means explore other stories. But I think it's still a really challenging process for a lot of people. And I'm very privileged that I live in Toronto. I have liberal friends. I have liberal family. It wasn't an issue for me, but for a lot of people, it is, and it's something. It's kind of like it's coming of age. I mean, it's a real milestone in some people's lives, and I think that's something that always needs to be explored, and that and again, people don't have to, but I don't think we should say, oh no, it's passe. I don't think people's experiences are all going to be different. So yeah, I would say we definitely still need those stories.
Great, thank you. Nathan, what do you think?
I think as soon as you take a bigger sort of a larger look at what coming out stories have already been told, you'll notice that it's actually quite narrow. Like the coming out stories that I bumped into when I was doing a lot of reading for YA and the history of YA, it was white boys coming out over and over and over again in suburban families. So I think, I don't think it'll ever be over, but I think we really need to cast a wider net. Is where I would probably come down on where about coming out. And also, again, like I think of, like, I'm sort of adjacent to the deaf community a lot, and there's a different experience the moment you step out of what we unfortunately refer to as the mainstream communities of the world. Like, so it's a unique story depending on where you are. Like, you know, coming out in liberal Ottawa is different than coming out in rural Saskatchewan, is different than coming out in another country, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the pieces we're missing, is that it's so often said that something is over, but when we say it's over for like the cisgender white characters. And I think that's a big piece of the puzzle.
Very, very good point. Thank you. Adriana, what are your thoughts?
Nathan covered so much of what I had to say. But yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think like what we need more of is the stories that haven't been in the queer romance space. And I think those stories will come with their own complexities. I just wrote a coming out story that's coming out next month. It's set in Ethiopia. One of the characters is Dominican American, one of the characters is Ethiopian. And he's a professional. He loves his country. It's not okay to be gay there. And it's not a negative story. It's a story about how much he loves who he is, where he is, and his struggle of knowing that when he comes to the States for school, it's going to be different for him going home and having to hide that part of himself. And it's a very different type of coming out story than, let's say, for example, a story about two suburban people in like New York. Like, I live in suburban New York City. It's a very different place than that. So I think that's the piece of the coming out story, or any other type of story that we have seen thus far in queer romances, the idea that there's so much more out there that we haven't seen yet in terms of different identities and backgrounds.
Great, thank you. GB, do you have any thoughts to add?
Pretty much what's been said already. If you have a coming out story that hasn't been told and that needs telling, by all means do so. Just don't tread over the same ground over and over again. And I think that's true for a lot of plot lines. So yeah, I don't have anything intelligent to add to that.
Okay, thank you. Kelly.
Yeah, I mean, what everyone else has said already. I think as long as someone feels they have that story to tell, they're going to tell it. And it's going to be important to them. And also, it's a story of overcoming adversity, and that's always a popular theme. So those stories are still going to be told. For me personally, I like writing and would like to see more of coming out stories for people who have been married before and are now divorced or moved on, or after the death of a partner, have decided to maybe live a life that they put on hold before, or have come to the realization that they're not as straight as they thought they were. I think there's always room for those stories, because there's an audience, or there's a generation who still don't know that it's okay to be who they are. So I would like to see more of those stories.
Thanks. Sheri Lynn, you have any thoughts on that?
Not sure I've got much new to say. Pretty much a lot of people have said the same things. I do say that I would love to see more of coming out older. I was late 30s when I said, hey, I'm asexual. And it was actually harder to come out as asexual than it was gay, because my family like, oh, we've known you were gay, but the asexual, it's hard to get people to believe. So I think we need more of that kind of stuff too.
Really good point. Kristine.
Yeah, I mean, I personally like coming out stories, and I think that, as Sheri Lynn was alluding to, like all aspects of the queer community, you come out as different parts at different times in your lives, and I think if you're an 18-year-old in Washington State, it's very different from being with a 40-year-old in maybe the Middle East, right? Or with Middle Eastern background, the coming out will not be at all the same. And also, people come out like very often, like almost daily, right? Every time you encounter somebody new. So there's always a coming out story, even within another story. That's my opinion.
That's a good point. I've seen that come up quite a bit in the whole idea of it's not just one coming out, like you said, it's
right.
Every new person that you encounter. Jay Leigh. You're on mute, Jay Leigh.
All right, can you hear me now? Okay. Sorry, I was having a lot of trouble with the unmute button. I don't have a lot to add. I think mostly everyone said it really well, probably better than I could have. Where I struggle with the coming out story, having written one, is when we'll call it the coming out is the plot. As long as there's other stuff going on, I'm okay with it. I particularly agree with the idea of the other coming out, like getting outside of that area that we've read so much of, right? But yeah, so I think everyone said it really well.
So we had a comment from one of the audience. Ethan Dax has said that coming out can be coming out as trans, like they did. So that's a good point too. And I think that ties into what Sheri Lynn was saying, is that it's not always, you find other aspects of identity, as we evolve as people. I mean, that happens. So we did have a few questions from the audience. Ethan Dax, wanted to know, do you think books with trans characters would sell in the romance industry? He says the reason for the question is that I am a trans man that has started to write romance. So let's start off with Adriana on that question.
I mean, I hope so. I hope that publishing in the romance community, I don't know, I hope so. Like, that we can make a space for those stories. I know that there was that Tor, I think Tor just put out a book that was written by a trans man recently, and like, I hope that that's just the beginning of how, like, my wish is that there is, like, the next 5 years of queer romance, we will see a lot of more own voices, stories written by trans romance authors, by authors of color, of like all those different like pieces of like the queer story that we haven't heard like as much as we should. So I hope, I mean, I certainly will be reading them and like boosting them if I find them.
Thank you. Nathan, what do you think?
I think what Adriana said at the end there is probably going to be the paramount piece of the puzzle. Is if we do not lift up voices, it's going to be so much harder, if at all possible. So, when you see authors talking about the books that they are reading, because again, our readers watch us to see what we are reading. If all the books we're reading are retreading the same ground and aren't stepping outside of what I'm talking about earlier, the white gay guys in suburbia, if that's all I read and all I talk about, I'm already doing a disservice to romance as in general. So I think that's part of the answer. Has to be that we have to help. And we have to pass the mic and lift people up. And if you're invited to speak on a panel, look at everybody else on the panel and ask yourself, like, what am I bringing to this that's different? and can I suggest someone else? That kind of stuff has to be the hard, and admittedly, it's painful to step aside when you already feel like you don't have access to a microphone. But I honestly think that is what it will take.
Thank you. Keira, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely hope that trans romance will get more readership. And I would say if I wouldn't worry too much about getting a publisher, say, you know, if you can't find a publisher, then self-publish it, because we need those voices to be heard. And I think we can't wait for traditional publishing to catch up. We absolutely need those voices now.
Excellent point. Kelly.
Yeah, I think that there's a reader for every story, and if you want to read it, someone else wants to read it. You know, everybody, there are people who want these stories, and so there should definitely be a place for them, stories that we can all promote. And like Keira said, you know, if you can't find a publisher who's interested in it, because publishing, it's so slow, it's so behind the times. Self-publish it, and the community will help you promote it.
Thank you. Kristine, what are your thoughts?
Yes, and I think there's definitely a market for it. There's a readership for it in the self-publishing world. There's some authors that are doing fairly well that are trans themselves and write trans romance. So if that's what you want to write, please go ahead and do it. We're interested to read it.
Great, thank you. Sheri Lynn?
I like everybody else. I say write it. Can't tell you how many times I go to a convention and I get a lot of younger people asking me for different types of stories, and I keep a list and I start handing them out, saying, "Here's YA, here's trans, here's." So if the more we get, the better it is. And yeah, we're gonna help promote it because we need more of it. So definitely write it.
Great, thank you. Jay Leigh.
Okay, hi. I'm going to agree with what everybody else is already saying. I have hope that there's a room for it. I believe that there is a readership for it. I've seen some really good examples in the indie world. I haven't seen as much in the traditional publishing side of things. But if we can shine enough light on it, then even traditional publishing might catch up eventually. But I wouldn't wait for that. So they're important stories that I want to read more of. So I want people write these stories. Let's get them written. Let's get them read. And then as a group or a community, we can push those because I think they're important and I want to see more of them. So if you've got the story and you've got the idea, let's get it written and get it out there.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, GB, sorry.
I think it's changing too. We've had more traditional publishers also asking for especially own voices stories. Is it going to sell a ton? I don't think so, unfortunately. But as far as I'm concerned, if there's one person out there whose life you're going to change, write that thing, put it out there. Yeah, somebody said if you want to read it, somebody else is going to want to read it. And I agree with that. And it's important to put it out there. The other thing is that if you're trying to write to the market, yeah, you're probably always going to be behind. That is something that never happens. So just write it. If you want it, if you want to write it, write it.
Great, thank you. And Ethan, I will add here that you might want to check out the works by Matthew Metzger. He is a trans author who writes about trans characters, so that could be something you could have a look at. I'm not sure if he's published by a publisher or indie publishing, but he has a lot of books out there. And another book that has really interesting trans rep in a fantasy world is Megan Durr has her Tales from the High Court series, which is fantasy romance, and she has trans representation in her books. So those are just two that, on the top of my head, that I could name. But there are many more out there that are in the small publisher or the indie realm. So hopefully you'll get kind of an idea from those what kind of stories are being published out there. Okay, so we had another question from the audience. From Rabe11 says, thank you for this wonderful panel. My question is, what was the last romance you read that you felt represented by, that you saw yourself in? So let's start off with Sheri Lynn.
Just recently, I read a book, Upside Down by N.R. Walker, and it was absolutely amazing book. And it was an asexual couple, and them meeting, one of them coming to terms with being asexual, going to meetings, and just, it was an amazing book. I just really loved that one, and it touched me a lot.
Great. Kristine?
I'm not sure that question really applies to me. I'm het, so.
Okay, no worries. Thanks. Jaylee? And by the way, if it doesn't apply, just say it doesn't apply. That's fine. There's no problem.
So there's been a couple that I've really liked that really helped kind of, we'll just say, help me identify my own labels a little bit. But Squared Away by Annabeth Albert had a really good look at demisexual rep, and that was almost eye-opening for me. Like, I was like, oh my God, this is a real thing. So I've been seeing a little bit more of that lately. TJ Klune, How to Be a Movie Star, which is not at all representative of me as a personality, but I thought they did a great job of kind of showing some of those aspects of what it means to be asexual and demisexual. So those are two that I would recommend from that side of things.
Great, thank you. GB?
I think I would have to say Static by L.A. Witt, which is a speculative novel about a world in which there are people that change genders. Unfortunately, it's still very bi gender, so there's male and there's female and there's nothing in between or other, but that is probably the one that comes closest to putting the finger right on where I felt, God, I wish this had been there when I was like 15 or so.
Hey, thanks. I read that book. That was a really interesting and plot that she had in that book.
Yeah.
It was really cool. Let's move on. Keira.
Yeah, my mind is blank, and I'm sure I cannot think of. And I've just been reading a lot of historical, doing a deep dive into the past because I don't want to read anything contemporary right now. It really stresses me out. I haven't read anything lately that I feel that way about.
I completely get that. I've been reading tons and tons of just fluff, which I don't normally read a lot of, just because of the escapism element. Nathan?
I think I've got two. One comes from science fiction, and it's called The Voyages of Sinrak the Dapper. And bear with me, but it's about a lesbian capybara pirate. Anyway, it's a collection of short fiction. It's interconnected, and the entire concept of this book was basically queer joy and found family. And those stories were just so much what I needed at the moment, and like little chinchilla trans boy cabin boys. It was just amazing, and it's this incredibly adorable book. So if you're looking for something fluffy and joyful, The Voyages of Sinrak the Dapper. Specifically from romance, though, this might sound a little weird, but the Rebecca Weatherspoon's Cowboy to Remember. Even though it's nominally a straight romance, the woman's group of friends are queer in such a brilliantly representative way that just felt like coming home. So that's one of the most recent times I've ever seen sort of my queer lived reality just on the page.
Awesome. Adriana.
That's a tough one for me because, I mean, I would say Rebecca Weatherspoon's books are a good place where I can find friend groups that look like my friend groups. But I think most recently, probably, I find a lot more of my intersected identities in YA. I think they're just like a little bit ahead of us, well, a lot ahead of us in terms of that kind of representation. But I'd probably say Elizabeth Acevedo, The Poet X, is probably the book. She's a Dominican author, and it's probably the book where I've seen like all sides of myself in a book.
Thank you. And Kelly.
I haven't been reading a lot of romance lately, so I don't really have an answer. It's a question I'd have to research. I'd have to go back. I mean, I read 250 books a year, and I know that 50 of them have just been like, yes, this was me. This is the book that I picked just to see myself represented. But one just isn't coming to mind right now. Sorry.
That's me. Like, somebody asked me, what's your favorite song? I've never listened to music before. Okay, the next question that I had, and thank you very much to the audience for asking questions, and please do keep them coming if you do have anything else that comes to mind. But the next question that I had actually ties into something that Adriana just said. YA seems to have a lot of very successful and popular books with queer rep. Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda comes to mind. I mean, that's one of the bigger ones that I can think of. Do you think that that's going to translate into the adult fiction and romance area? Or like, is it already translating over into it? Will it translate over? What do you think about that? Let's start with Kelly, since you're on my screen.
I think it is. I think it's going to be a slower uptake than with young adult fiction. But I mean, an area that I'm really interested in breaking into as an author is this women's fiction area, because it's something that I read as a 52-year-old. I love reading books about older people still living their lives and still doing really interesting things, which is what a lot of that fiction covers. But I want stories like that have queer representation. And those are the books that I'm sort of more interested in writing right now. So I'm, of course, really hoping that there's a place for those, and that those are going to become more mainstream in the way that the young adult queer rep books have been.
Thanks. Let's go back to Adriana, since that was kind of tying into what you were saying about YA.
I mean, I think if we're ready for it, if we have because I think what's organic to the YA reader is reading worlds where there is all kinds of people, and it reflects the world that they live in, where there's people of color, where there's trans people, where there's, gender non-conforming people. So I think if romance is prepared with what is organic for them to read, I think they'll come. And I think in terms of my own experience, like I write a very specific kind of story, and I think what readers have really responded to in my books is that part of it, where there's where it's a world where it's centered around a diverse community, and by diverse, it's like all kinds of diversity. So I think the interest is there, and I think if we as a genre like prepare for it and kind of like think a little bit bigger in terms of our representation, I think we're poised to get a lot of readers.
That's what I'm hoping too. Let's go to Nathan.
I'm going to put my bookseller hat back on. I was a manager at a bookstore for about 20 years. Generally speaking, YA does lead most of the charges. And it often gets dismissed as itself as YA. But yeah, like I don't want to say the word trend because I hate the word trend when it talks about marginalized identities and diversity. But it is where you are seeing it happen first, I think. And part of that, I think, comes from the fact that like the young adult readership and like, I mean, when I was working on my YA, I went to go speak to so many young queer groups. If I was allowed in, that was another problem. But they're already there. Like they want their stories told. It's the big five that are just now barely starting to realize that oh my gosh, they actually want those stories told. Because unfortunately, in the world of YA, it's still the adults that are buying everything. And it's the adults that are gatekeeping everything. So the librarians and the teachers and the publishers and the reps and the editors and the agents and everybody involved in the publishing industry is an adult. The readers of YA, they push and they shove and they make so much noise, and thank God they exist. But watching publishing change is like watching someone push a boulder up a hill. But yes, I do agree that YA comes first, and hopefully romance will follow.
Great, thank you. Keira, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think it's coming. When you look at a book like Red, White, and Royal Blue, it had the veneer of YA. It had a very YA-ish cover, and it's not actually that. I just saw the author the other day on Twitter saying, oh, it's actually not YA, it's NA adult romance. So, but I think a lot of people perceive it as being YA. So it's kind of like this gateway, if you will. You know, I think that it's coming, that there will be more, and hopefully they'll be just full on, you know, adult romances that a publisher won't feel the need to make it, you know, YA-ish. But things have changed. I published my first romance in 2006, which was shockingly 14 years ago somehow. And I mean, it's changed so much since then. When I started, it was very, very niche. It was really small. And it's just a world of difference today. So I think it's just going to continue to evolve and grow.
Great, thank you. Sheri Lynn.
I'm going to have to admit that I was listening and I still totally missed what the question was exactly. Jess kind of paraphrased for me because I was like, I messaged her quick. I'm like, what the hell? I'm confused.
No problem. Okay, so the idea of a YA has a lot of really successful queer representation or books with queer representation. Do you think that that is coming into adult romance, adult fiction? Do you think it's like on the process of coming in? Is it going to happen in the future? Do you think that we're going to see basically those readers from reading the YA with queer rep coming into reading adult books with queer rep?
Oh, so like as they age up, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. Like, are we going to see the same kind of, like, these people who are reading the YA, are they going to move into adults? Or, yeah.
I sure as hell hope so. I hope if they're readers for life. We just need more readers in general. Honestly, I really don't know. I hope so. But it's hard to say with kids nowadays with buying for computer space with everything.
Fair enough. Kristine, what are your thoughts?
I think that I think the answer is yes, in the sense that if we look at how things have changed, as others were saying, 15, 20 years ago, I mean, almost all of romance was straight white characters, and things have changed. And our children, like I have teenagers, they grew up in a different world than I did. It's much more racially integrated. There's a lot more, people are not their age or, very open about their sexuality, if they're asexual, anything, right? And so they want that in their stories. They want it on in their movies. They want it in their TV shows. They want it everywhere. And as they get older, they're not going to suddenly change and not want these things anymore. And they're also having an impact on their parents, which is why I think romance is becoming more diverse, because it's, we want to see in our books what we see in our lives, and it's there. We can't deny it anymore. Those that were denying it, of course.
Okay, thank you. Jay Leigh.
Yeah, I think it's a good sign of what the future is going to look like. I think on the whole, there's always been that spark of things that get introduced in the YA's field that sort of graduates and kind of trickles up to more of the adult side of things. And to Kristine's point, these, like the younger people who are kind of spearheading a lot of this, that's their current reality. They want to see all of that. And I think as they grow or become writers and more readers, I think we're going to see more of that. And in general, more acceptance or more expectation of a more diverse and open and sort of candid look at, what life is like. And so yes, I think it is going to kind of keep on creeping up. Like so many things right now in our world, I think the youth is sort of leading the way. And thank goodness for that, because honestly, but yeah, I think yes, that it's a good sign.
Great, thank you. And GB.
Yeah, that would be a definite yes for me too. For one thing, the people that read young adult yesterday, they're going to read adult today or tomorrow, and they're not going to change what they want to read. And for another thing, we see it more and more. We're talking about it in social media. We're seeing it on Netflix. Even primetime television has it. We have shows like Schitt's Creek that represent and that are winning awards left and right and center. And I don't think we can go back, which is the best thing that ever happened. Yeah.
Very good point. Okay, so we are now at 4 o'clock. I'm going to do one last question that is kind of a twofer. So what I'm going to do is ask you to talk about the favorite book you've written. So you're going to have to choose between your children and say which one is your favorite and why it is. And then also what I would like you to do is let readers know where they can find you. And that's how we'll close up. So let's start off with Adriana.
Oh, it's so hard. I would probably say American Love Story, which is the third book in my Dreamer series. And I think maybe it's just because it was the hardest one that I had to write. It was the one that gave me the most trouble. But I think it's a Black Lives Matter book. I think I'm feeling it more these days. It's a book about a Haitian professor who's a Black Lives Matter activist who falls for a prosecutor who's white in a small town where there are racially motivated traffic stops happening. And so the entire conflict of their being together is kind of like understanding what allyship means and the burden that activism can have on people of color. So I think that one, because it's something that is so important to me, is my favorite one.
And where can people find you?
People can find me on Twitter ranting at Adriana Herrera and in my website, AdrianaHerreraRomance.com.
Thank you. Nathan.
My favorite, My favorite book that I have written is going to be my collection of short stories Of Echoes Born, specifically because it was the only way I could get some stories published that weren't that were about gay men who were older, or gay men who were facing disease, or gay men who were recovering from life traumas. So, it is an uplifting book as a whole, I promise, and there's more than enough romance in there, but it was the only book where I kind of had the freedom to tell some of the stories that when I tried to tell them in mainstream romance, people are like, that's too depressing, or that's not, it's not what someone's looking for, that kind of thing. So I do promise the book as a whole is positive and uplifting. It's just, it was closer to my lived reality. And that's what I was trying to do with that book, even though it's chock full of magic and psychic and everything else as well. And finding me, if you look up Nathan Burgoine, pretty much everything is me. I have a weird last name. So nathanburgoine.com or Twitter, Nathan Burgoine, I'm there.
So thank you. Keira.
My favorite book that I've written is probably Kidnapped by the Pirate, which I grew up reading Bodice Rippers, Virginia Henley and Joanna Lindsay and all those books. And so I decided to write a Britches Ripper, and it was just really fun. And I really did it with no expectations of it being successful, because contemporary outsells historical, etc. But it's my best-selling book to date, and I think I just love it. And that's not why I love it, but it was just kind of, I guess, a childhood fantasy that I was able to write my own epic pirate romance. And you can find me, I'm Keira Andrews on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, and KeiraAndrews.com. There's links to everything there.
Awesome, thank you. GB.
Both Santuario books, and I think the first one probably still my favorite, mainly because that's the one I spent the most time with, that I carried around with me the longest. But yeah, the characters are not letting me go, still not letting me go. So I still have stuff happening in that world, and I hope it'll come out. It's an alternate universe cop story with murder case, and so yeah, social fiction, where in one of the cops' countries, gay people are absolute persona non grata. This is not a thing. And in the other cops' world, it's just normal. Nobody talks about it. And so yeah, it's a little bit of how alienated they each are by their different worlds and other. So it's a little bit not really enemies to lovers, but strangers to lovers story. Alien strangers sort of to lovers story. And I really love that. Oh yeah, and where can they find me? I'm mostly on Twitter at GB_Gordon. I'm a little bit on Instagram as well, and there is a closed group on Facebook called Hope Punk Central, and you can ask to be admitted there, and I will share little stories or links or stuff like that, either only to the group or first to the group. There's a little banter there, but not a lot, so it's not going to overwhelm anybody. And my website is gordon.context.ca.
Great, thank you. Jaylee.
So my favorite book that I've written is called Unexpecting, which isn't out yet. It's the one that I just finished that's going to come out at the beginning of 2022. So it's a long ways out, but it's a young adult story where a very scientific-minded 16-year-old decided to figure out if he was gay or not by sleeping with his female best friend, and she gets pregnant. And really the story is his journey on becoming a father. But yeah, definitely my favorite, but we've got a ways to wait on that one. Where you can find me, I'm Jenny Writes, that's Jenny with an I, on Twitter, or at jayleebailey.com is my website.
Thank you. Kelly.
I've pretty much changed my answer in my head after listening to everyone else, but it's because I mean, I love all of my books because there's some really important thing that I wanted to explore with each of them. Like the main character is taking this journey that I want to take with them. So I feel them all so deeply, but I decided to go with Keira on the book that was most fun to write. And that was Aliens in New York, Uncommon Ground. Elise Stevens approached me to write that. She had a short deadline. She was invited to do a Kindle World, and she wanted me to write a story set in her version of New York, but with science fiction. And so I just had to come up with something in a matter of days and start writing it. I wrote it in 6 weeks, and it was just, the minute Dylan and Lang landed on the page, it was just so much fun. They just like, oh yeah, we're here for this. We're going to write this story for you. And they did. They told me who they were. They went on this adventure. They took me around the parts of New York that I really loved. They explored what it is to be human, which is just one of my favorite questions. Is, you know, who are we as beings? And then they fell in love, which was just like the coolest thing ever. You know, I don't know how I was going to get an alien and an art student to fall in love, but they did. They liked each other. I didn't even have to try. And it was just fun. I mean, I wasn't writing it for a publisher. I was writing it for myself. I wasn't writing it for an audience. It was just something that I just wrote purely for fun. It was almost like writing fan fiction again. It was just for me. And yeah, it's one of my most popular books. It's one of my best-selling books, and I love it for that. You know, just me having fun ended up so well. Oh, where to find me? I'm mostly on Facebook, but I am on Twitter as well. It's KMK Jensen on Twitter, and Facebook is well, just Kelly Jensen. I don't know how you find me there, but all the links are on my Twitter bio, and my website is kellyjensenwrites.com.
Thank you. Sheri Lynn.
I always say when this question comes up, it's whatever book I'm writing at the moment, just because I've always put some piece of me in each story. So that one's my favorite. But in this case, the one I'm actually working on is my favorite because it'll be the first one I'm writing that's actually got asexual characters. So I think that's kind of just kind of close to my heart. So I think that's why it's my favorite. And the main characters are just going through hell with their past. And they're trying to, he was abused a lot as a kid. So he's trying to come to terms with that, and he's pushing everybody away. And then he's trying to figure out, you know, that asexual is a thing on top of that. So I think that's kind of why it's really close to my heart. Where to find me? I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram is Sheri Lynn Author, and then my website is thesherilynnauthor.com.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Kristine.
I'd have to say my favorite one is called Lover on Top. It was my first romance. And one of the reasons is it was a bisexual awakening of a man in his mid-30s and who had developed a drinking problem as a result of his denial of self, and his story continues, and it's falling in love with your best friend's younger brother book, the denial trope, the forbidden thing. So it's always a fun thing to write. I'm available. I mean, you can find me on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. My website, everything's at Kristine Cayne.
Great, thank you very much, everybody. It was great having you. This was a really nice way to spend an afternoon and have a good discussion. And it was awesome to see some new faces and some faces of people that I haven't seen in months or years. This whole social distancing thing kind of sucks. So anyway, I wish you all the best, and hopefully we can have a chat like this again soon. It was awesome. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.